Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories. Tonight we're doing something a little different, a little darker, and honestly a little overdue. We're diving into the story of the one pill that made heroin users physically impossible to quit. Not metaphorically impossible. Not well. It's a tough habit impossible. I mean clinically, chemically, neurologically chained to a substance impossible. We're talking about methadone, a drug invented by the Germans during World War II, adopted by American doctors with the best of intentions, and then quietly turned into one of the most controversial medical programs in the history of addiction treatment. Now, before you get comfortable, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It is always, without fail, somewhere between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., and I find that deeply relatable. Let's take a second before we get into this. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to be physically dependent on a substance? Not just really wanting something, like how you want your morning coffee, but genuinely needing it the way your lungs need air. Have you ever wondered what kind of person becomes a heroin addict? Was it a choice? Was it a chemical accident? Was it a bad week in 1962 that just kept getting worse? Have you ever thought about what it would feel like to finally find something that took away the withdrawal, that bone-deep, screaming, cold turkey nightmare, only to discover that the cure came with its own set of chains? Did the doctors know? Did they care? Was this medicine, or was it just trading one leash for a slightly longer one? And now, congratulations, you have just woken up in the 1960s. You're somewhere in New York City. It smells like cigarettes and ambition and bad decisions. There's a man in a lab coat with a clipboard and a very controversial idea, and he is about to change addiction medicine forever. Whether that change was a miracle or a trap depends entirely on who you ask. Let's find out together. Before methadone was the centerpiece of the most debated addiction treatment program in American history, it was a painkiller invented in a German laboratory with a name no one could pronounce and a purpose no one fully understood yet. The year was 1937, and a team of German chemists at the pharmaceutical company E.G. Farben were quietly looking for a synthetic substitute for morphine. Germany was preparing for war, and the military needed a pain reliever that didn't depend on the opium supply lines of Asia. What they cooked up in those sterile humming labs wasn't glamorous. It wasn't described with excitement in the press. It was simply a molecule, a man-made opioid with no poppy plant in its lineage, no ancient history, and no romantic mythology attached to it. Its original German name was Hochst, 10,820. If that sounds less like a drug name and more like a filing cabinet reference number, that's because in 1937, nobody was planning for it to become a household controversy. It was just a chemical that worked on pain, and the Germans needed chemicals that worked on pain. What nobody in that laboratory could have predicted, and what history has a particular fondness for doing, which is taking something entirely ordinary and turning it into something enormous, was that this filing cabinet molecule would spend the next 80 years at the center of some of the most charged arguments in American medicine, law, and social policy. Arguments about what addiction is, who addicts are, what they deserve, and whether medicine is allowed to help them. Not bad for something named after a 4-digit stock number. When the war ended, Allied forces moved through Germany collecting whatever was useful, which included pharmaceutical research, rocket science, and, as it turned out, the formula for Hochst 10,820. American pharmaceutical companies acquired the rights, gave it a new name, methadone, derived partly from its chemical components, and began studying what else it might be good for. It was a reasonable painkiller. It was long-acting. It was cheaper to produce than morphine. For a while it sat in the mid-tier of available analgesics. Useful, not particularly exciting, the beige sedan of the opioid world. Nobody was talking about addiction treatment yet. That conversation was still decades away, waiting in the wings of a heroin epidemic that hadn't quite arrived, being assembled piece by piece in the poppy fields of Asia and the shipping routes of the post-war world and the neighbourhoods of American cities that were about to become very well acquainted with what opioid dependence looked like at scale. Methadone was just sitting there, doing its unremarkable job, waiting. And this is worth pausing on, because it matters for understanding everything that comes later. Methadone did not begin as an addiction treatment. It was not designed with addicts in mind. Nobody in a German laboratory in 1937 was thinking about the heroin epidemic of the 1960s, or the opioid crisis of the 2000s, or the waiting rooms of American clinics where people would stand in line every morning for decades holding paper cups. The drug preceded the problem it would eventually be asked to solve by more than 20 years. It arrived before anyone knew what it was for. And then the world caught up to it, and everything got complicated. That is not a story about a drug. That is a story about how solutions sometimes exist before the problem is ready to acknowledge itself, sitting on a shelf, wearing a number instead of a name, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The right question, when it finally arrived, would come from a metabolic disease researcher in Manhattan who was tired of watching people die of something that looked, to him, increasingly like a medical condition wearing a moral costume. But that comes later. First, we need to talk about the brain. To understand why methadone matters and why the pill made quitting so brutally complicated, you first need to understand what heroin does to the human brain when it arrives, and more importantly, what happens when it leaves. Heroin enters the bloodstream almost immediately after use, and within seconds it crosses the blood-brain barrier, a phrase that sounds very official and scientific, but basically means it gets past the brain's security guard faster than a backstage pass at a concert. Once inside, it converts to morphine and floods the brain's opioid receptors, the same receptors that your own body uses to manage pain, regulate mood, and produce the gentle background hum of feeling okay that most people take completely for granted. In a person who has never used heroin, those receptors are doing their quiet daily work, releasing a little dopamine here, a little endorphin there. But heroin doesn't offer a gentle hum. It offers a wave, a warm, overwhelming, all-consuming wave that the brain has never felt at that magnitude before, and immediately, desperately, catastrophically wants to feel again. Here is what the science says happens next, and it is not metaphorical. The brain, which is an extraordinarily efficient adaptation machine, responds to repeated exposure to heroin the way it responds to any repeated intense stimulus. It adjusts, specifically it downregulates. The receptors that were flooded with opioids begin to reduce in number and sensitivity because the brain is trying to restore equilibrium. Think of it like turning down the volume on a speaker that's been blasting at maximum for weeks. The brain is doing its best to adapt to an impossible situation. The problem is that this adaptation means the person now needs more heroin to achieve the same effect, and more importantly, without heroin, their baseline level of comfort is no longer neutral, it is negative. The floor of normal has dropped. This is what tolerance means in a physiological sense. It is not a character flaw, it is the brain doing exactly what brains are supposed to do, which is learn and adjust, applied to a situation that brains were not designed to encounter. And this is also what dependence means. Not that the person enjoys heroin so much they keep choosing it, but that without it, the brain is now missing something it has reorganized itself to expect. The absence of heroin in a brain that has adapted to its presence does not feel like neutrality, it feels like illness. And this matters enormously for understanding why the question, why don't they just stop, is, from a neurological standpoint, roughly equivalent to asking someone why they don't just stop having low blood sugar. The mechanism has changed. The baseline has shifted. What you're asking them to do is function normally inside a brain that has fundamentally reorganized its chemistry around a substance that is no longer there. That reorganization does not reverse itself quickly. In some cases, research suggests, it does not fully reverse itself at all, that years of opioid use leave lasting changes in the brain's reward circuitry that persist long after the drug is gone, which is part of why relapse rates remain elevated years into recovery. Understanding this, really understanding it, not just nodding at it as a concept, but sitting with the implications, is what makes the rest of this story make sense. Because methadone was invented precisely to work on this mechanism, to give the brain the opioid signal it had reorganized itself to require, without the spike and crash that made heroin so destabilizing. It was, at its best, a biological bridge. The question was always, a bridge to what, and for how long, and who gets to decide? For most of American history, the official answer to heroin addiction was some version of just stop. Get yourself to a hospital, sweat it out, endure the withdrawal, and then simply choose not to use again. This approach had the advantage of being morally uncomplicated, and the disadvantage of almost never working. Heroin withdrawal is not the kind of thing that responds well to willpower. Within hours of the last dose, the body begins to revolt. The opioid receptors, flooded for so long with the artificial warmth of the drug, suddenly find themselves completely empty, and they respond the way any neglected system responds, by screaming. The muscles cramp. The skin crawls with a sensation that people describe as bugs moving just underneath the surface. Vomiting, diarrhea, insomnia, fever, chills, and a bone-deep restlessness that makes it physically impossible to stay still all arrive at roughly the same time and then stay, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. Doctors knew this was happening. But for a long time, the prevailing attitude in American medicine was that addiction was a moral failing, not a medical condition, and moral failings were not solved with prescriptions. This attitude had deep roots, and those roots were tangled with religion, with law, and with the particular American belief that suffering is sometimes redemptive, and that a person who suffers enough for their bad choices will eventually be reformed by the experience. It is a belief that has a long and distinguished history in contexts where it applies, and a long and considerably less distinguished history in contexts where it doesn't. Cold turkey withdrawal from heroin is not redemptive. It is not clarifying. It does not produce, in most cases, a person who has reckoned with their choices and emerged transformed. It produces a person who has been extremely sick for a week, whose brain chemistry has not fundamentally changed, and who is now on the other side of physical withdrawal, with every neurological craving intact and a body that has just lost whatever tolerance it had built up, which means that if they use again, they're at significantly elevated risk of overdose. This was known, not as loudly as it needed to be, and not as early as it should have been, but the people working directly with addicts in American cities in the 1950s and 60s were watching the pattern repeat with a regularity that had become genuinely demoralizing. Patients would come in, go through withdrawal, get discharged, and return using within days or weeks. The revolving door was not a metaphor. It was the dominant structural feature of addiction treatment during this period, a literal, physical, institution-sized door through which the same people moved in regular rotations, their files getting thicker, their prognoses getting no better. What was missing from the official response was an honest engagement with the biology of the problem, to acknowledge that withdrawal was not the hard part, that the hard part was what came after, the months and years of a brain recalibrated to expect a substance that was no longer there, would have required acknowledging that addiction was a condition with a physical substrate that persisted beyond the acute phase of withdrawal. And that acknowledgement, in the moral and political climate of mid-century America, was not easy to make. It carried implications that the culture was not prepared to accept, that some people might need long-term medical management indefinitely, the same way diabetics needed. Insulin or hypertensives needed medication. That for some people, clean and sober was not achievable by willpower, on any timeline that a treatment episode could contain. The person who was willing to say this out loud in a research hospital in New York City in the early 1960s was not a drug counsellor or a social worker or a recovered addict. He was a metabolic disease researcher who had looked at addiction through the wrong lens, which turned out to be exactly the right one. In 1963, a metabolic disease researcher named Vincent Dole at Rockefeller University in New York City did something that most of his colleagues considered either visionary or completely insane, depending on which side of the argument they were standing on. He decided to treat heroin addiction like a disease, not a weakness, not a character flaw, not a spiritual problem requiring church attendance and better life choices. A disease, the kind that had a biological mechanism, a measurable effect on the body, and potentially a medical treatment. Dole was not an addiction specialist. He studied metabolism, the way the body processes and uses substances, and he brought that lens to addiction with a clarity that the field had been missing for decades. Together with his colleague Marie Niswander, a psychiatrist who had spent years working with addicts in New York's most difficult neighborhoods, and had grown increasingly frustrated by the total uselessness of existing treatments, Dole began an experiment that would eventually change the landscape of addiction medicine in ways both profound and deeply complicated. Niswander was in many ways the human half of the partnership. She'd been watching people cycle through treatment and relapse with a compassion that had curdled, over years, into something closer to fury. Not at the patients, but a system that kept insisting the same ineffective approach would eventually produce a different result. She had written a book, published in 1956, called The Drug Addict as a Patient, in which she argued, at a time when this was genuinely radical, that addiction should be treated with the same non-judgmental medical attention given to any other illness. The book was well reviewed and largely ignored by the policymakers who most needed to read it. When Dole approached her about collaborating on a research project to study the metabolic aspects of opioid dependence, Niswander said yes with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for a differently framed question. Together, they began developing a hypothesis that chronic heroin use produced lasting metabolic changes in the brain, changes that created a persistent physiological need for opioids that did not simply resolve when the drug was removed. If this was correct, it had significant implications. It meant that the craving that drove relapse was not a character weakness, but a biological signal, and it meant that a medication that addressed that biological signal might succeed where every moral and behavioural intervention had failed. What followed was science conducted with a combination of rigour and genuine human attentiveness that is not always present in research settings. Dole and Niswander admitted patients to the research ward at Rockefeller University Hospital, a setting that was, for many of them, the most comfortable and well-resourced environment they had been in for years, and they watched carefully what happened when those patients were given methadone. They adjusted doses, they took notes, they talked to patients. They paid attention to what patients told them about their own experience, which was, at the time, not a standard feature of addiction research. What they found became one of the most influential clinical observations in 20th century medicine. Patients stabilized on adequate doses of methadone stopped craving heroin. They were not high. They were not sedated. They were present, able to engage in conversation, to participate in the world, to think about something other than their next fix. For people who had organized their entire existence around the acquisition of a substance for years, The experience of simply not thinking about it was, some described, almost incomprehensible. Like a noise that had been playing so long you'd forgotten it was noise, and then it stopped. Dole called this the blocking effect. The metabolic hypothesis held, and in 1965 he and Niswander published their findings in a paper that landed in the medical literature like a stone thrown into a very calm, very ideologically committed pond. The early patients in Dole and Niswander's methadone trials were not the kind of people that 1960s America was inclined to sympathise with. They were long-term heroin addicts, many of them with criminal records, most of them having cycled through detox programs multiple times without lasting success. They were the people that the medical establishment had largely given up on, the ones who kept relapsing, kept disappearing from treatment programs, kept showing up in emergency rooms or jails or morgues with a grim, predictable regularity that had started to feel like inevitability. Dole and Niswander brought some of these patients into Rockefeller University Hospital, a setting that felt almost comically mismatched with what they were used to. Clean, white-walled, staffed with researchers in lab coats rather than overworked social workers in community health centres. The patients were given oral doses of methadone, a long-acting opioid that would occupy the same brain receptors as heroin, without producing the same intense high, and then they were watched. What happened next surprised almost everyone except, possibly, the patients themselves. The first cohort was small, just a handful of men admitted to the research ward in the early months of 1964. They were not selected because they were the best candidates for treatment. They were selected because they were available, willing, and representative of the people for whom existing treatments had most thoroughly failed. Several had been using heroin for a decade or more. Several had been in and out of the Federal Narcotics Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, the country's primary facility for treating addiction at the time, where the treatment was essentially enforced abstinence in a controlled environment, and where the relapse rate after discharge was high enough that going to Lexington had become something of a grim joke among addicts who had been there, gotten clean, and been back using within weeks of returning home. What these patients experienced on methadone was not, they were careful to say, the same as what they experienced on heroin. There was no rush, no flood, no intense euphoric wave that reorganised the next several hours around its own memory. What there was, instead, was an absence, a specific, remarkable, almost impossible to describe absence of the craving that had been the background noise of their lives for years. They could eat breakfast and think about something other than where their next fix was coming from. They could hold a conversation for more than 5 minutes without the pull of compulsion dragging their attention sideways. They could sleep. One patient, describing his experience in the early months of treatment to Niswander, said something that she would quote for the rest of her career. He said that on methadone he felt the way he imagined normal people felt all the time. Just normal, not high, not sick, normal. And he said it like it was a gift he had never expected to receive, which, for someone whose neurochemistry had been reorganised around a substance for the better part of a decade, it essentially was. The results from this first small cohort were striking enough that Dole and Niswander expanded the programme, carefully, methodically, tracking outcomes with the rigour of researchers who knew they were going to face significant scepticism and wanted their data to be unassailable. Employment rates went up, criminal activity went down, patients who had been cycling through jails and hospitals stabilised. The numbers were not ambiguous. The question was whether the world outside the research ward was ready to hear them. Methadone worked because of a property that sounds almost too simple to be medically significant. It lasted a long time. Where heroin floods the brain in a matter of seconds and then fades within hours, sending the user scrambling for their next fix in a cycle that structures and destroys entire lives, methadone was absorbed slowly, peaked gently, and stayed in the system for anywhere from 24 to 36 hours. When taken orally in a carefully calibrated dose, it didn't produce the euphoric rush that made heroin so addictive. What it produced instead was something much quieter, and in some ways much more powerful. It produced normal. Patients on adequate doses of methadone described feeling the way they imagined non-addicted people felt all the time. Not high, not sick, just present. Functional. Able to hold a conversation without thinking about their next fix. Able to sleep through the night. Able to eat breakfast without vomiting. For people who had spent years organising their entire existence around the acquisition and use of heroin, this was not a small thing. But to critics watching from outside the experiment, the fact that methadone worked by giving patients another opioid was not a comfort. It was the whole problem. The pharmacology is worth understanding in slightly more detail, because it explains something that the critics consistently misrepresented. Methadone is a full opioid agonist. It activates opioid receptors completely, unlike the partial agonist that would come later. But the route of administration and the rate of absorption changed everything about how those activated receptors felt. The euphoric rush of heroin is a product of its speed. The rapid spike in opioid receptor activation is what produces the intense high that the brain immediately wants to repeat. Methadone, taken orally, rises slowly in the bloodstream over several hours and then stays elevated, like a long flat plateau rather than a sharp spike. The brain's reward system, which responds most powerfully to rapid changes rather than steady states, does not read this as a rush. It reads it as background, as close to normal as someone with reorganized opioid receptors can get. This also meant that when heroin was used on top of a stabilizing methadone dose, the rush was blocked, the receptors were already occupied, and the heroin had nowhere to go. Patients reported that using heroin while on adequate methadone simply didn't produce the expected effect. The drug didn't work. This was not a moral intervention, it was a chemical one, and it removed one of the most powerful reinforcing loops in addiction, the reward that the brain expected from use, with something approaching efficiency. So why did this make people nervous? Because the people who were made nervous were not primarily concerned with mechanism. They were concerned with meaning. And the meaning of giving an opioid to an opioid addict, in the cultural and political context of 1960s America, was not easily separated from the meaning of enabling, condoning, or refusing to take seriously the gravity of addiction. The abstinence-based recovery culture, which was dominant, which was genuinely helping some people, and which had a substantial emotional and institutional investment in the idea that recovery meant complete freedom from all mind-altering substances, looked at methadone and saw a shortcut, a crutch, a way of avoiding the real work. The medical researchers looked at methadone and saw outcomes. These two things were looking at the same drug and finding entirely different realities, and they would not stop disagreeing for the next 60 years. From the moment methadone maintenance treatment became public, the criticism arrived fast and it arrived loud. And if you have ever heard anyone say they're just trading one addiction for another, you have heard the core of the argument that has dogged this treatment program for 60 years. The objection was intuitive and emotionally satisfying, and, depending on how you defined your terms, not entirely wrong. Methadone was an opioid. Patients taking it were physically dependent on it. If they stopped suddenly, they would experience withdrawal that was by many accounts longer and in some ways more grueling than heroin withdrawal, because methadone stayed in the system so much longer. So yes, in a strict pharmacological sense, patients on methadone maintenance were dependent on a substance, but Dole and Niswander, and later the broader addiction medicine community, pushed back on the framing with a comparison that remains useful to this day: insulin. A diabetic person who takes insulin every day is physically dependent on insulin. Without it, they will become very sick. Nobody describes that person as addicted to insulin. Nobody frames their daily dose as a moral failure. The dependence is medical. The treatment is maintenance. Why, they asked, was opioid use disorder any different? The answer, which the critics did not always state directly, but which was embedded in the structure of the argument, was that opioid use disorder was different because of how it began. Diabetes was not a choice, heroin was. This argument had a surface logic that was hard to dismiss without a longer conversation about the neuroscience of addiction and the role of environmental factors and trauma in shaping vulnerability to substance use, conversations that were happening in research settings but had not yet made their way into the popular understanding of what addiction was. And even setting aside the question of how addiction began, the critics argued the goal of treatment should be abstinence. Full stop. A treatment that replaced one substance with another was not treatment. It was management. And management in this framework was not good enough. What this framing consistently failed to account for was outcomes. When you looked at what happened to people's lives, not their urine tests, not the moral category of their treatment, but their actual day-to-day existence, the comparison between methadone maintenance and untreated addiction, or between methadone maintenance and abstinence-based treatment without medication, was not ambiguous. People in methadone maintenance treatment were alive at higher rates. They were employed at higher rates. They were arrested at lower rates. Their children were more likely to be cared for. Their families were more likely to stay intact. By every social outcome measure that anyone tracked, maintenance treatment produced better results than the alternatives. This evidence did not resolve the argument. It rarely does, when the argument is actually about values rather than outcomes. The trading one addiction for another critique was not primarily a clinical claim. It was a moral one, a statement about what recovery was supposed to mean and who got to count as recovered. And moral frameworks, particularly ones with deep roots in religious and cultural traditions about redemption, sacrifice, and the transformative power of suffering, do not yield easily to randomized controlled trials. The argument is still happening. It will probably never fully stop. By the late 1960s, Dolan-Niswander's results were compelling enough that word was spreading beyond Rockefeller University, and the federal government, never an institution known for moving quickly or calmly when drugs were involved, started paying attention. The Nixon administration, which would famously declare a war on drugs in 1971, found itself in the slightly awkward position of simultaneously wanting to crack down on drug use and needing to do something about the heroin epidemic that was visibly ravaging American cities. Methadone maintenance offered a pragmatic, if philosophically uncomfortable middle ground. It wasn't abstinence. It wasn't the moral crusade that the war on drugs rhetoric demanded. But it reduced crime. Studies were already showing this with uncomfortable clarity, and it kept addicts alive and increasingly employed and housed and out of emergency rooms. In 1972, the FDA formally approved methadone for the treatment of opioid addiction, establishing a regulatory framework that would shape how the drug was dispensed for the next 5 decades. The regulatory framework that emerged was shaped by 2 competing impulses that never fully resolved their tension. The first was the public health impulse. Get this effective treatment to the people who need it. Reduce harm, reduce crime, save lives. The second was the control impulse. Make absolutely sure that methadone, a powerful opioid that could be diverted and misused, did not become another street drug, another source of harm, another political liability. The control impulse won, and it won convincingly. The regulations that the FDA, the DEA, and eventually SAMHSA the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, developed around methadone were among the most restrictive ever applied to a medication in American history. Methadone for addiction treatment could only be dispensed through specifically licensed opioid treatment programs. It could not be prescribed in a doctor's office and filled at a pharmacy, the way virtually every other medication in the American healthcare system worked. It could not be sent home with patients except under specific conditions that required months of demonstrated compliance to unlock. The clinic model, the daily attendance, the observed dosing, the urine testing, the counselling requirements, was baked into the regulatory structure. From the beginning, and once baked in, it proved remarkably resistant to revision. The political context of this cannot be separated from the regulatory outcome. 1972 was deep in the Nixon era. The war on drugs framing was ascendant. The patient population for methadone treatment was disproportionately black and Latino and urban, which placed it in the crosshairs of a political dynamic that was not about public health and never really pretended to be. The regulations reflected, among other things, a fundamental ambivalence about whether addicts, these specific addicts, in these specific communities were patients deserving of accessible medical care, or problems requiring managed containment. The fact that those two orientations produced very different regulatory structures, and that the containment model is the one that prevailed, is a piece of history that the subsequent decades have not allowed to be easily forgotten. If you've ever picked up a prescription at a pharmacy, pulled up to the drive-through window, handed over your insurance card, driven away 3 minutes later with a paper bag of pills, then the experience of receiving methadone treatment in a federally regulated clinic will require some adjustment of your mental image. Patients receiving methadone maintenance did not get to take their medication home in most cases, particularly not at first. They were required to come to the clinic in person, every day, 7 days a week, including holidays. They stood in line, sometimes very long lines in not very comfortable waiting areas, and they watched as a nurse poured their measured dose into a small paper cup, and they drank it in front of the nurse, who watched to make sure they swallowed it, because the rules demanded this level of oversight. The logic was harm reduction combined with diversion control. Methadone dispensed carelessly could be sold on the street, and street methadone could kill people who didn't have opioid tolerance. But the daily requirement felt to many patients less like medical treatment and more like a form of supervised probation, a daily reminder that they were not trusted, that their condition carried a stigma that no other chronic illness was expected to absorb in quite this way. The comparison to other chronic disease treatment is instructive. A patient with severe depression who's been stable on an antidepressant for 6 months is not required to come to a clinic every morning to drink their medication in front of a nurse. A patient who has been stable on blood pressure medication for a year does not submit weekly urine samples to prove they haven't been using salt. The level of surveillance embedded in the methadone clinic model was calibrated not to the medical requirements of the treatment, but to the social status of the patients receiving it, and to the particular set of anxieties that the word addict activated in the regulatory imagination. For patients who worked, the daily attendance requirement was a problem that no amount of goodwill could fully solve. Showing up at a clinic between 6 and 8 in the morning, every morning, before a job that started at 8:30 across town without a car, on public transit that was unreliable, was not a logistical challenge that yielded to motivation. It was a structural barrier, built into the system not incidentally but as a feature, and it filtered out quietly and systematically many of the patients who were simultaneously the most employed, the most functional, and arguably the most able to use treatment as a genuine foundation for a stable life. Those who navigated the system, who learned which counsellors were helpful and which to avoid, who managed the daily logistics of attendance for months until they earned take-home doses, who understood how to communicate with clinic staff in the register that got requests taken seriously. Those patients often described the experience in terms that mixed genuine gratitude for the treatment with a distinct and unvanishing awareness of what it cost them to receive it. The medicine worked. The delivery system made it as hard as possible to benefit from. Methadone maintenance treatment was not available equally to everyone who needed it. This is one of the parts of the story that the official histories tend to mention briefly and then move past, but it deserves its own full section. The clinics that opened in the 1970s were concentrated in cities, which meant that rural heroin users, already more isolated, already facing more limited access to any kind of healthcare, were largely left out of the program. The regulatory requirements were demanding in ways that disadvantage people with unstable housing, chaotic lives, and the kinds of daily logistical challenges that long-term addiction tends to produce. You needed reliable transportation to get to the clinic every morning. You needed to be able to arrive during business hours. You needed to navigate a bureaucracy that was not always welcoming and not always staffed with people who had much patience for the complications of addiction. And you needed often to be able to pay, because while some public funding existed, coverage was inconsistent and many patients faced costs that were not trivial for people who had spent years unemployed or incarcerated. The geography of access told a story that maps of clinic locations made visible if anyone cared to look. In New York, Chicago, Baltimore, San Francisco, cities where the heroin epidemic of the 1960s and 70s was most concentrated and most visible, clinics existed and served large numbers of patients. Drive 2 hours from any of those cities and the landscape changed. In rural counties, in small towns, in the vast stretches of America that existed between the urban centres where policy was made and evaluated, treatment simply was not there. This was not an oversight. Clinics required federal licensure, regulatory compliance, physical infrastructure, staffing, and ongoing oversight. They were not easy to open, particularly in communities with fewer resources and less established healthcare infrastructure. The regulatory model that was supposed to ensure safety had, as a secondary effect, made access a function of geography in a way that had no parallel in any other area of medicine. This left a particular population without options. The person in a rural county who had become dependent on opioids, prescription pills initially, in many cases from a pain clinic that had been rather free with its prescriptions, and who needed treatment and could not travel 2 hours each way every morning, and could not take time off work and didn't have someone to watch the children, and lived 45 minutes from the nearest bus stop. This person existed in very large numbers. They showed up in hospital emergency departments in rural counties with overdoses. They showed up in county jails. They showed up in obituaries in local newspapers that described them as having passed away unexpectedly, which was a kind way of saying the same thing that the data was saying less kindly. The treatment that existed was not designed for them. It had been designed for a specific urban patient population in a specific regulatory moment by people who were primarily thinking about that population and that moment. The patients who didn't fit the model didn't get treatment. They got, at best, the phone number of a clinic that was too far away to reach, which is a piece of paper that functions, in practice, as a very polite form of abandonment. One of the most politically inconvenient findings in the early history of methadone maintenance was that it worked, not just in the sense that it kept patients from using heroin, which it did, measurably and consistently, but in the sense that it dramatically reduced the criminal activity associated with addiction. Heroin addiction in the 1960s and 70s drove an enormous amount of property crime. People who needed to spend several $100s a day on a substance they were physically unable to stop using found the money wherever they could find it, and wherever they could find it often meant theft, robbery, or prostitution. This was not a moral judgment. It was arithmetic. The cost of addiction forced crime. When patients entered methadone maintenance and no longer needed to hustle to pay for heroin, the crime stopped. Multiple studies tracking patients before and after treatment entry documented dramatic drops in arrest rates, in self-reported criminal activity, in incarceration. Employers hired people in treatment. Families began to reconnect. Children came home. The data was good enough that it made the ideological opposition to methadone awkward, in a very specific way. You are now in the position of opposing a treatment because it involved giving an opioid to opioid addicts, even though the actual real-world outcomes of the treatment were positive by almost every measure you could name. The researchers who tracked these numbers were not naive about what they were documenting. They knew the findings were going to be used in political arguments, and they were careful to be precise about what the data did and did not show. What it showed was a before and after comparison that was difficult to dismiss. Studies from New York in the late 1960s found that patients who entered methadone maintenance and remained in treatment showed arrest rates that dropped by more than 70% compared to the year before treatment entry. Employment rates doubled, then tripled. Patients who had been spending their days navigating the logistics of active addiction, finding money, finding drugs, avoiding arrest, recovering from use, suddenly had time, unstructured, unfamiliar, slightly bewildering amounts of time that they were no longer spending on any of those things. What they did with that time became one of the more interesting and humanizing chapters in the early literature. They got jobs. They went back to school. They moved into stable housing. They called their mothers. The crime reduction data landed in the policy world with the particular awkwardness of evidence that contradicts a preferred narrative. The preferred narrative, in the law enforcement community and in much of the political establishment, was that the solution to drug-related crime was more aggressive enforcement, more arrests, longer sentences, stronger deterrence. Methadone treatment suggested a different mechanism entirely, that the crime was not primarily a product of criminal character, but of economic desperation produced by addiction, and that removing the addiction removed the desperation and therefore the crime. This was not a comfortable conclusion for institutions that had organised significant portions of their budgets and their identities around the enforcement approach. What happened, as a result, was a kind of institutional compartmentalisation. The crime reduction data was acknowledged in public health circles, cited in treatment advocacy, and largely set aside in law enforcement and criminal justice policy discussions, which continued to operate on the assumption that the correct response to drug-related crime was criminal punishment rather than medical treatment. The two systems, public health and criminal justice, processed the same evidence in ways that produced entirely different conclusions, and they operated largely in parallel for decades, occasionally intersecting in ways that were not always good for the patients caught between them. A person could be enrolled in a methadone program and simultaneously subject to a criminal justice system that treated their addiction as a character flaw deserving punishment rather than a medical condition deserving treatment. Both things were true at once. The numbers argued for one approach. The system delivered another. Here is something that would be funny if it weren't so consistently devastating. Even as methadone maintenance patients stabilized their lives, found jobs, repaired relationships, and by every external measure became the kind of functioning members of society that the public claimed to want addicts to become, they were still treated by wide swaths of society as though they were not really in recovery, not really clean, not really deserving of the credit given to people who achieved abstinence through sheer force of will and regular attendance at 12-step meetings. The hierarchy of recovery, the cultural ranking that placed abstinence at the top, and medication-assisted treatment somewhere much lower, often phrased as not real recovery, was not a fringe position. It was embedded in how employers handled disclosure, how courts handled the question of whether medication-assisted treatment patients could keep custody of their children, how 12-step programs sometimes refused to recognize medication-assisted treatment as legitimate sobriety. Patients were told by judges to stop their methadone as a condition of probation. Children were removed from the homes of parents who were stable and employed and engaged in treatment because a family court decided that being on methadone was incompatible with good parenting. The drug that worked was also the drug that came with a social penalty that abstinence did not. This stigma operated on multiple levels simultaneously, which made it particularly difficult to address. At the individual level, it showed up in the small daily interactions that patients navigated without any formal mechanism for redress. The employer who asked during an interview whether they were taking any medications, and whose face changed when the answer was methadone. The landlord who found a reason to decline the rental application. The family member who continued to treat the patient as an active addict despite years of stability, because the medication meant to them that the problem had not really been solved. These were not illegal discriminations in most cases, or not provably so. They were the ordinary texture of a stigma that had been decades in the making and was not going to be dissolved by a treatment success story. At the institutional level, the stigma was encoded into rules. Family court guidelines in multiple states created presumptions against parents on medication-assisted treatment that had no parallel for parents managing other chronic conditions with medication. Pain management specialists sometimes refused to treat methadone patients for unrelated pain conditions, concerned about interactions or liability, or in some cases simply unwilling to engage with a patient population they associated with drug seeking. Employers in safety-sensitive industries used methadone status as grounds for termination or disqualification, applying a standard that no other prescribed medication was held to. The Americans with Disabilities Act offered some protection in theory, but the practical cost of asserting that protection, the legal fees, the time, the disclosure required, was a barrier that most patients could not afford. The 12-step community's ambivalence about medication-assisted treatment deserves its own paragraph because it was particularly impactful given how central 12-step programs were to the recovery culture of the late 20th century. The tradition of complete abstinence from all mood-altering substances that was foundational to programs like Narcotics Anonymous put methadone patients in an impossible position. They were seeking community and support among people who defined recovery in a way that excluded them by definition. Some meetings were welcoming, others were not. The message received in the unwelcoming ones that the patient was not truly in recovery, that the methadone was just another way of not dealing with the real problem, was delivered with the particular authority of people who had suffered and survived, which made it land harder than it might have from a stranger. One of the most consequential debates inside the world of methadone treatment was not visible from the outside and was barely covered by the press, but it shaped the outcomes of millions of patients over decades. How much methadone was enough? The answer, it turned out, was deeply contested, and the camps that formed around the question were not just arguing about pharmacology, they were arguing about philosophy. The data, going back to Dole and Nicewander's original research, consistently showed that higher doses of methadone, in the range of 80 to 120 milligrams per day or more, were more effective at blocking cravings, preventing relapse and retaining patients in treatment. But many clinics, particularly those operating under the influence of the abstinence-oriented recovery culture, dispensed much lower doses, 20 milligrams, 30 milligrams, doses that a pharmacologist looking at the data would describe as subtherapeutic, meaning not enough to do the medical job the drug was supposed to do. Patients on inadequate doses continued to crave heroin. They relapsed. And then the clinic, or the court, or the family member pointed to the relapse as evidence that methadone didn't really work, without acknowledging that the methadone had never been given a real chance to work because the dose had been too low from the beginning. The philosophical disagreement underneath the dosing debate was about what methadone was for. If you believe that methadone was a bridge, a temporary stabilizing agent that should be tapered as quickly as possible toward abstinence, then lower doses made sense as a step toward the eventual goal of zero. You wanted to give patients just enough to prevent acute withdrawal while simultaneously encouraging them toward the exit. The dose was a way of signaling intent. High doses said, "We expect you to be here a long time." Low doses said, "We expect you to be moving toward something else." The problem was that the patient's brains did not share this philosophical orientation. The biological mechanism of opioid dependence did not respond to the clinic's aspirations for it. A brain that needed 80 milligrams to block cravings effectively was not going to be satisfied by 30 milligrams in a motivational conversation. The research on this was remarkably consistent over a remarkably long period of time. Study after study, conducted over decades in multiple countries, found the same thing. Higher doses produce better outcomes, better retention in treatment, lower rates of illicit opioid use, better social functioning. The dose-response relationship was not subtle or ambiguous. It was about as clear as clinical research ever gets, and yet the low-dose culture persisted in clinics across the country, driven by a combination of ideology, regulatory conservatism, and a failure to translate research findings into clinical practice that is, unfortunately, not unique to addiction medicine, but is particularly costly there because the stakes, life and death, quite literally, are so immediate. Patients who had been in the system for years sometimes became sophisticated advocates for their own dosing, arriving at appointments with printed research papers and requests for increases that were not always received with the open-mindedness that the evidence warranted. Some found clinics where the medical director understood the literature and dosed accordingly. Others remained on inadequate doses for years, continuing to struggle, continuing to use, continuing to have their difficulties pointed to as evidence of their insufficient commitment to recovery, rather than evidence of a correctable medical miscalculation. There is a particular piece of information that tends to land very differently, depending on whether you are a policymaker reading a report or a patient living through the experience, and that information is this. Methadone withdrawal is longer than heroin withdrawal, sometimes significantly longer. Because methadone is fat-soluble and has a very long half-life, the amount of time it takes for the body to process half of a dose, it stores in body tissues and releases slowly over time. This means that when a patient stops taking methadone, the withdrawal does not peak sharply and then subside the way heroin withdrawal does. Instead, it builds gradually, over days, sometimes reaching its worst intensity a week or more after the last dose, and then it lingers. People who have gone through both describe methadone withdrawal as a slow grind rather than an acute crisis, less like being hit by a car and more like being run over very gradually by something extremely heavy that doesn't seem to be in a hurry. The insomnia can last for weeks. The restlessness, the anxiety, the physical discomfort, all of it extends on a timeline that makes cold turkey cessation of methadone one of the more genuinely difficult things the human body is asked to do. The medical literature on methadone withdrawal is detailed enough to be instructive and uncomfortable enough to explain a great deal about why so many patients remain in maintenance treatment for years or decades rather than tapering off. The acute withdrawal phase, the period of most intense physical symptoms, can begin 2 to 4 days after the last dose, reach peak intensity around the first or second week, and then continue at a lower but still significant level for weeks afterward. Post-acute withdrawal syndrome, a cluster of symptoms including anxiety, insomnia, mood instability, and persistent low-grade physical discomfort can persist for months. Patients who have tapered gradually, reducing their dose slowly over months rather than stopping abruptly, report somewhat less severe experiences, but even medically supervised gradual tapers frequently produce withdrawal experiences that are protracted and difficult enough to constitute a significant barrier to discontinuation. This is not a reason to never discontinue methadone. Some patients do taper successfully and maintain their recovery without medication. The research suggests these patients tend to have been in treatment for longer periods, have stronger social support networks, and have addressed the underlying factors: trauma, mental health conditions, chronic pain, housing instability that contributed to their addiction in the first place. Taper is possible. It is simply not the simple or obvious endpoint that the abstinence-oriented framing assumes it to be, and the timeline on which it becomes achievable for patients who are ready to attempt it is measured in years rather than months. What the withdrawal experience also explains, and what the policy discussions about methadone have consistently underweighted, is why forced discontinuation, the kind imposed by a court order, a clinic expulsion, a prison sentence that interrupts treatment, is so medically dangerous. A patient who is removed from methadone abruptly, without a medically supervised taper, faces a withdrawal experience of considerable severity, followed by a period of reduced opioid tolerance during which any return to use carries a dramatically elevated overdose risk. The brain that spent years on methadone maintenance has not returned to its pre-addiction baseline. It is in a state of acute disruption, with a reduced tolerance that does not match the dose the person's memory associates with their previous use. People die in this gap. This is not a hypothetical. It is one of the most well-documented causes of overdose death in the opioid treatment literature, and it happens with a frequency that should produce more outrage than it does, as a direct consequence of policy decisions made by courts, jails, and institutions that remove patients from treatment without medical oversight. In 2002, the FDA approved buprenorphine, sold under the brand name Suboxone among others, for the treatment of opioid addiction, and the politics of medication-assisted treatment shifted in ways that were interesting, revealing, and not entirely flattering to the medical establishment. Buprenorphine was a partial opioid agonist rather than a full one, which meant it activated opioid receptors only partially, reducing cravings and withdrawal without producing a strong high, and with a ceiling effect that made it significantly harder to overdose on than methadone. These were genuine pharmacological advantages, but buprenorphine also had a political advantage that had nothing to do with its molecular structure. It could be prescribed by a doctor and taken at home. A patient with a buprenorphine prescription could fill it at a regular pharmacy, carry the medication home, and take it privately, with a level of autonomy that methadone patients had been denied for 30 years. The implications of this disparity were uncomfortable. If buprenorphine patients were trusted to manage their medication at home, why had methadone patients been required to come to a clinic every morning for decades? The answer, which the medical and regulatory community spent some time dancing around, had less to do with pharmacology and more to do with which patients each drug was historically associated with. Buprenorphine's approval under the Drug Addiction Treatment Act of 2000 was genuinely significant in clinical terms. The ceiling effect, the property that above a certain dose, additional buprenorphine produced no additional opioid effect, made it substantially safer than methadone in the event of accidental ingestion or misuse. The combination formulation with naloxone, an opioid antagonist that blocked the drug's effects if injected rather than taken sublingually as prescribed, further reduced diversion risk. These were real improvements in the pharmacological toolkit for treating opioid use disorder, and the prescribing physicians who began offering buprenorphine in their offices were providing genuine access to treatment that the clinic model had failed to deliver to many patients. But the rollout of buprenorphine coincided, not coincidentally, with a shift in the demographic profile of opioid addiction in the United States. The prescription opioid epidemic of the late 1990s and 2000s was producing a new population of people with opioid use disorder. People who were, on average, whiter, more suburban, more middle class than the heroin users who had populated the methadone clinics of the 1970s, and the treatment that was promoted for this population, buprenorphine, prescribable in a doctor's office, takeable at home, available without daily clinic attendance, was regulated in a way that reflected a fundamentally different level of trust in the patient. The contrast was not lost on advocates, researchers, or patients who had spent years navigating the methadone clinic system, the same federal government that had required methadone patients to attend a clinic every day for months before earning the privilege of taking their medication home, was now approving a system in which a physician could prescribe a month's supply of an opioid medication to a new patient on the first visit. The pharmacological differences between the drugs were real, but did not by themselves account for the regulatory difference. What accounted for the regulatory difference, many argued, was the race and class of the populations each drug was expected to serve. The history of methadone cannot be told honestly without talking about who was in the clinics and who was not, and what that looked like in terms of race and class. Methadone clinics in American cities from the 1970s onward served a patient population that was disproportionately poor and disproportionately black and Latino, a reflection of where heroin epidemics had hit hardest in those decades, and also a reflection of which communities had access to the alternatives. The highly regulated, heavily supervised daily attendance clinic model was applied to these patients with a thoroughness that would have been considered invasive and paternalistic if applied to any other medical treatment in any other patient population. Decades later, when the opioid epidemic of the late 1990s and 2000s began devastating predominantly white, rural and suburban communities, buprenorphine, the medication that could be taken at home, prescribed in a doctor's office, used with considerably more privacy and autonomy, was promoted as the preferred treatment. The disparity in how these two medications were regulated, the different levels of trust extended to their respective patient populations, prompted questions that researchers and advocates began asking publicly, and that the policy world found uncomfortable, but could not entirely avoid. Was the treatment you received shaped by the pharmacology of your drug, or by who you were when you walked in the door? The research that began examining this question in the 2000s and 2010s found patterns that were difficult to attribute to anything other than the intersection of race and policy. Studies found that black patients with opioid use disorder were significantly less likely than white patients to receive any form of medication-assisted treatment. Among those who did receive treatment, black patients were more likely to receive methadone, with its attendant clinic requirements and restrictions, while white patients were more likely to receive buprenorphine, with its relative autonomy and privacy. The differential was not explained by clinical factors. It was not the case that black patients had more severe addiction profiles that required the more intensive monitoring of clinic-based treatment. The differential tracked with geography, with insurance type, with whether a patient was presenting in a primary care setting, or an emergency department, or a criminal justice setting, and all of those factors correlated in turn with race and class in ways that were not coincidental. The historical narrative underneath these patterns stretched back to the beginning of American drug policy. The earliest federal anti-drug legislation, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, was passed in a context saturated with racialized anxiety about opium use in Chinese immigrant communities and cocaine use among black Americans in the South. The framing of drug use as a problem of dangerous racialized others who needed to be controlled rather than treated was present at the creation of the American drug policy framework, and it shaped every subsequent iteration of that framework in ways that were sometimes explicit and sometimes embedded in the structure of regulations that appeared racially neutral on their face while producing racially disparate outcomes in practice. Acknowledging this history is not the same as claiming that every methadone regulation was motivated by conscious racial animus. Most of the people who wrote the rules were not sitting in rooms thinking about how to disadvantage black patients. They were thinking about diversion, about safety, about political liability, about the constituencies they needed to satisfy. But the constituencies they were most attentive to, the political pressures they were most responsive to, and the mental image of the addict that organised their regulatory imagination were all shaped by a cultural context in which race and drug use had been entangled for a century. The result, whatever the intent, was a system in which the colour of your skin was a meaningful predictor of the quality and accessibility of the treatment you received for a medical condition. When the opioid overdose crisis began accelerating dramatically in the 2000s, and then the 2010s, methadone's relationship to that crisis turned out to be complicated in ways that required careful untangling. On one hand, methadone maintenance treatment remained one of the most evidence-supported interventions for opioid use disorder, study after study confirming what Dole and Niswander had found in the 1960s, that patients in treatment had dramatically better outcomes than patients not in treatment. On the other hand, methadone dispensed outside of the clinic setting, methadone prescribed for pain rather than for addiction treatment, which was regulated entirely differently and could be prescribed in much larger quantities and taken home, was implicated in a significant portion of opioid overdose deaths. These were not the same thing, but they were the same drug, and the distinction was lost on most news coverage, most policy discussions, and most public perception. Methadone, the addiction treatment, and methadone, the pain management medication, were regulated by entirely different rules, prescribed by entirely different systems, and used by entirely different patient populations. But in news headlines and congressional hearings, they frequently collapsed into a single alarming noun. The pain management story is worth understanding in some detail because it illustrates, with particular clarity, the ways in which American drug policy has historically created problems while trying to solve them. Methadone was approved for pain management separately from its addiction treatment use, and pain management methadone was regulated like any other Schedule II controlled substance, which is to say it could be prescribed by any physician with a DEA license, filled at any pharmacy, and taken home in quantities that reflected the prescriber's clinical judgment about what the patient needed. For chronic pain patients, methadone had some genuine advantages. It was cheap, it was long-acting, and it was effective for certain types of pain that responded less well to other opioids. Pain management physicians began prescribing it in larger volumes in the late 1990s and 2000s. The overdose problem that emerged from pain management methadone had several contributing mechanisms. Methadone's long half-life, which made it useful for maintenance, also made it dangerous in acute dosing situations. The drug accumulated in the body over days, and patients or prescribers who didn't account for this accumulation could inadvertently reach toxic levels. Drug interactions with other common medications could slow methadone's metabolism, increasing blood levels unexpectedly. And methadone diverted from pain management prescriptions entered the street supply and reached people without opioid tolerance, for whom doses that would have been manageable for a chronic user were lethal. By the mid-2000s, methadone was responsible for a disproportionate share of opioid overdose deaths relative to its prescription volume, a statistic that generated alarmed headlines and regulatory responses targeting methadone broadly, without always distinguishing carefully between the pain management context, where the problems were concentrated, and the addiction treatment context, where methadone was saving lives. The collateral damage of this conflation landed on addiction treatment patients, whose access to a medication with a decades-long evidence base was periodically threatened by policy responses designed to address a problem in an entirely different part of the healthcare system. The drug was the same, the context was not. The policy frequently failed to make the distinction. Walk up to a methadone clinic at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday in almost any American city and you will find people waiting. Some have been there since before the doors opened. Some drove 45 minutes from a town that has no clinic of its own. Some took the bus. Some have young children sitting beside them in plastic chairs. Most of them are carrying a coffee cup and wearing the particular expression of people who are doing the thing they are supposed to do and do not entirely enjoy being reminded of it this early in the morning. The waiting room of a methadone clinic is one of the more honest spaces in American medicine, a room where the pretense of normal doctor-patient interaction is stripped away by the sheer logistics of the thing, where the medical necessity of daily attendance makes invisible the kind of privacy that most medical care takes for granted. Patients check in. They may give a urine sample. They wait for their name to be called. They go to the window or the booth or the small dispensing room depending on the clinic, and they receive their dose, which they drink in front of a staff member, and then they leave. The daily ritual accumulated meaning over time in ways that differed by patient. For some, it became something close to routine, stripped of most of its emotional charge after months of repetition, a necessary stop in the morning, like getting gas, logistically inconvenient but no longer particularly loaded. For others, it remained an experience that carried a daily weight of self-consciousness that never fully dissipated. The act of standing in a line to receive medication under observation in a designated facility whose purpose everyone in the vicinity understood was not experienced neutrally by patients who were also navigating jobs, families, and communities in which their treatment status was something they managed carefully. Running into a neighbour in the parking lot, driving a work vehicle to the clinic and wondering who might notice, explaining to an employer for the third time why you needed to arrive 30 minutes late on certain mornings. The staff relationships that developed inside this daily ritual varied enormously and mattered enormously. Patients who encountered counsellors and nurses who treated them with consistent dignity and took their medical concerns seriously described those relationships as among the most stabilising features of the treatment experience, a reliable, non-judgmental human contact point in a process that could otherwise feel purely bureaucratic. Patients who encountered staff who were dismissive, suspicious, or openly contemptuous of their patient population described a daily dread that compounded the other challenges of being in treatment. The clinic model concentrated enormous informal power in frontline staff. The nurse who decided whether a complaint about dosing was worth escalating, the counsellor who determined whether a positive drug test resulted in a take-home restriction, and the exercise of that power was not always subject to meaningful oversight. The physical environments of clinics ranged from adequate to genuinely grim. Some were well lit, clean, staffed by people who had clearly thought about what a welcoming healthcare environment looked like. Others were cramped, institutional spaces in neighbourhoods where clinics had been located precisely because local opposition had blocked them from anywhere else. The product of NIMBYism applied to healthcare, with the same community that expressed concern about addicts also successfully arguing that the facility serving those addicts should not be near schools, residential neighbourhoods, or anywhere that might suggest that the patients had neighbours rather than just problems. Something that the popular imagination of addiction treatment tends not to account for is the long-term patient, the person who entered methadone maintenance treatment in 1975 and is still, in 2025, taking their daily dose. These patients exist. There are more of them than policy discussions tend to acknowledge. They are, by almost any reasonable measure, success stories, alive, stable, often employed for decades, raising families, contributing to communities, not using heroin. But they are also people who have been coming to a clinic every morning for 50 years, or 40 years, or 35 years, and who face the question of how long they are expected to continue with a regularity that no other chronic disease patient is asked to field in quite the same way. The diabetic on insulin for 50 years is not regularly asked when they plan to get off the insulin. The hypertension patient on medication for decades is not required to demonstrate at regular intervals their commitment to eventually achieving medication-free blood pressure. But the methadone patient navigates a world in which the long duration of their treatment is sometimes treated not as evidence of a manageable chronic condition, but as evidence of a program that has failed to achieve its goal, with that goal understood not as stability and health, but as the specific absence of any opioid substance in the body. The long-term patient accumulates a particular kind of knowledge about the treatment system that shorter-term patients don't have. They remember when the regulations were stricter. They remember specific policy changes and the practical effect those changes had on their daily lives. They remember counsellors who helped and counsellors who didn't, and they have a longitudinal perspective on their own stability. Decades of evidence that the medication is doing what it is supposed to do. That is, ironically, sometimes received with more skepticism than the enthusiasm of a newer patient who's been doing well for 6 months. The long-term patient is no longer a success story in the making. They're a success story that requires ongoing maintenance, and that ongoing maintenance is, for some observers, itself uncomfortable evidence that something has not been resolved. What the long-term patient's existence challenges is the narrative of recovery as a journey with a destination. American recovery culture is deeply oriented toward transformation, toward the idea that the person who is in recovery is moving towards something, that their current state is a transitional one, that the goal is a future self who no longer requires the scaffolding of treatment. This narrative is meaningful for people for whom it is true, but it fits badly around the reality of chronic disease management, where the goal is not transformation but maintenance, and where the scaffolding is not transitional but permanent. A person who has been stable on methadone for 40 years has not failed to achieve recovery. They have achieved it repeatedly every day for 4 decades. The medication is part of how they achieve it. The insistence that the medication is a problem to be eventually solved rather than a tool that works is not coming from the data. It is coming from a cultural story about what recovery is supposed to look like. The long-term patient also raises practical questions that the healthcare system has not fully resolved. As patients age, as the cohort that entered treatment in the 1970s moves through their 60s, 70s and 80s, questions about how methadone interacts with other medications, with age-related changes in metabolism, with cognitive decline, with end-of-life care, become clinically relevant in ways that the original research program never anticipated, and that the current clinical infrastructure is variably prepared to address. Inside and outside the methadone treatment world, the word detox carries a weight that it probably doesn't deserve, an implication that getting through withdrawal is the hard part, and that once you've gotten through it, the work is essentially done. It isn't. The medical community has understood for decades that detox alone, in the absence of ongoing treatment, produces relapse rates that are depressingly consistent. Studies following patients through medically supervised withdrawal programs and then tracking them over the following months found that the vast majority returned to opioid use, not because they didn't want to be sober, not because they lacked willpower or motivation, but because addiction is a chronic brain condition and detox addresses only one small piece of it. The cravings that return after withdrawal are not a moral failure. They are a neurological reality produced by years of changes to the brain's reward circuitry, changes that do not reverse themselves simply because the substance has been physically removed from the body. Methadone maintenance was built on this understanding, that the goal was not to produce a dramatic detox event but to provide long-term stabilization, the way that effective treatment for any chronic condition provides long-term stabilization rather than a one-time cure. The detox fantasy, the belief that getting clean is the event and that everything after is just not using, is powerful because it maps onto a human need for narrative resolution. We want the story to have a turning point, a moment where the problem is defeated and the victory is won. Detox offers that moment. It is concrete, time-limited, and visually legible as an ordeal that is endured and survived. The months and years of work that follow, the cognitive restructuring, the addressing of underlying trauma, the rebuilding of a life organized around something other than substance use, are less narratively satisfying because they have no clear beginning and no clear end, and they don't look like anything in particular from the outside. Insurance structures in the American healthcare system have historically reinforced the detox fantasy by funding it. A residential detox program, a week or two of medically supervised withdrawal, was more reliably covered by insurance than the long-term outpatient treatment that the evidence said was actually effective. This created a perverse incentive structure in which the least effective component of addiction treatment was the best funded, while the most effective components, long-term medication management, integrated mental health care, stable housing support, were either underfunded, inconsistently covered, or not covered at all. Patients who could get insurance approval for a 30-day residential detox program could not always get approval for the buprenorphine prescription or the ongoing counselling that would have given that detox its best chance of lasting. The research on this has been consistent for decades and consistently underimplemented. Detox without ongoing treatment produces relapse rates above 80% within the first year in most studies. Medication-assisted treatment with adequate support produces substantially better attention and substantially lower relapse rates. The gap between what the evidence says works and what the system funds is not a gap produced by ignorance. It is a gap produced by values, by a preference for the moral narrative of the dramatic cleansing event over the less satisfying but more effective reality of chronic disease management. And people die in that gap, quietly, in numbers that would generate different headlines if the deaths were attributed more directly to the policy failures that contributed to them. For most of the history of methadone treatment, the people making the rules, writing the regulations, speaking to the press, and shaping the public understanding of the program were not the patients themselves. They were researchers, policymakers, clinic administrators, law enforcement officials, and public health advocates. People with varying degrees of direct experience with addiction and with widely varying levels of interest in what patients themselves thought about the program. Patient advocacy in medication-assisted treatment was slow to develop, partly because the stigma attached to addiction made public advocacy risky for people who were not ready to disclose their status, and partly because the structure of the program, daily clinic attendance, constant monitoring, limited autonomy, did not lend itself to organising. When patient voices did begin to emerge more clearly, in advocacy organisations and in the research literature, and eventually in mainstream media coverage, what they said was often more nuanced than the debate around them. Patients spoke about the real benefits of treatment, the stability, the reclaimed life, the years they had not lost to active addiction. They also spoke about the indignities of daily attendance, the stigma, the condescension they sometimes encountered from staff, and the ways the program's rules made it harder, rather than easier, to rebuild the normal life that treatment was supposed to make possible. The emergence of patient advocacy in this space followed a pattern that will be familiar to anyone who has studied the history of other stigmatized medical conditions. HIV and AIDS activism in the 1980s and 90s provided something of a template, a demonstration that people living with a stigmatized, poorly understood, politically contested condition could organize, demand a seat at the table where decisions about their care were made, and produce meaningful changes in research priorities, regulatory processes, and treatment access. The AIDS crisis produced ACT UP. The opioid crisis, decades later, produced organisations like the National Alliance for Medication-Assisted Recovery and smaller local advocacy groups that began pushing back against clinic policies, discriminatory regulations, and the broader cultural framework that treated methadone patients as problems to be managed rather than people to be served. What distinguished the patient voice from the policy voice was its specificity. The researchers and regulators talked about methadone patients as a population, in aggregate, in statistical terms that were accurate and important and also somewhat abstracting. The kind of language that makes it possible to discuss hundreds of thousands of lives without ever quite reckoning with what any single one of those lives felt like from the inside. The patients who began speaking publicly talked about specifics. The morning they got to the clinic and found it closed for a holiday they hadn't been informed about. The judge who told them their medication was incompatible with their parole conditions. The employer who rescinded a job offer when the drug screen came back positive for methadone. The custody hearing where their years of stability and treatment were presented by opposing counsel as evidence of ongoing drug dependence. These stories did not replace the statistical literature. They inhabited it, gave it a texture and a weight that aggregate numbers could not provide. The internet accelerated this process enormously. Online forums and communities where people in medication-assisted treatment could share experiences, compare notes on clinics, discuss dosing questions, and support each other through the logistical and emotional challenges of the program created something that had not previously existed. A distributed, self-organizing patient community that was not dependent on any clinic or institution for its existence. People who had felt entirely alone in their experience discovered that their experience was widely shared, which is both a comfort and, when the shared experience includes systematic mistreatment, a call to action. The patient voice, once it found channels through which to travel, proved remarkably difficult to ignore. Not impossible, but remarkably difficult. In March of 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic shut down normal life across the United States, methadone clinics faced a problem that, viewed from a certain angle, was illuminating. You could not ask patients to come to a clinic every morning when there was a deadly respiratory virus circulating and public gatherings were banned. The regulatory agencies that had resisted take-home methadone for decades suddenly, under emergency conditions, permitted clinics to dispense larger supplies, enough for weeks rather than days, to stable patients. And what happened? The feared catastrophes, the diversion, the overdoses, the abuse of take-home privileges did not materialize at the scale that the restrictions had been designed to prevent. Patients managed their medication responsibly. The clinics that had resisted expanded take-home doses for years found that expanded take-home doses worked. Patient advocates and researchers who had been making this argument for decades were gratified in a way that was tinged with some understandable frustration. The evidence had been available for a long time. It had taken a global pandemic to get the regulatory agencies to test it. The specific emergency flexibilities that SAMHSA issued in March of 2020 allowed clinics to provide stable patients with up to 28 days of take-home methadone doses at a time, and less stable patients with up to 14 days. These were levels of take-home access that would have been considered extraordinary, even reckless, under the pre-pandemic regulatory framework. Clinics implemented them quickly because they had no choice, and then they watched what happened. What happened was largely what the research had been predicting for years. Patients took their medication as prescribed, didn't flood the street supply with diverted doses at any detectable scale, and continued to do well in treatment. Some patients, freed from the daily attendance requirement, reported improvements in their employment situations, their family lives, and their general ability to function. Improvements that the daily clinic visit had been actively obstructing. The research that followed tracked outcomes during the flexibilities with the urgency of scientists who understood they were witnessing a natural experiment that would have been impossible to design deliberately. The results were published quickly, and they pointed consistently in the same direction. Expanded take-home access did not increase harm. In some measures, it reduced it. Patients retained in treatment at higher rates. Reports of illicit drug use did not increase. Overdose deaths among treatment patients did not spike. The public health case for maintaining the expanded flexibilities permanently, which had always been strong on theoretical grounds, was now backed by real-world data from a national implementation. And yet the question of whether the pandemic-era changes would become permanent proved to be exactly as politically complicated as the previous 60 years of methadone regulation suggested it would be. Some of the flexibilities were extended past the end of the official public health emergency. Some were codified into updated regulations. But the full liberalisation that patient advocates and researchers called for, the kind of structural change that would have brought methadone regulation into alignment with the evidence base, and with the regulatory framework applied to buprenorphine, did not materialise cleanly or completely. The system that had taken 60 years to build its current shape did not dismantle itself in 2 years, even when a global pandemic had demonstrated, with uncomfortable clarity, that significant portions of that shape had never been about patient safety. They had been about something else, something that proved in the end more durable than a public health emergency. The United States was not the only country that developed methadone maintenance treatment, and it was not the only country that wrestled with how to regulate it, and it was not the country that ended up with the least restrictive approach. Other nations, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Switzerland, the Netherlands, developed their own versions of medication-assisted treatment with varying degrees of autonomy for patients, varying rules about take-home doses, varying levels of integration into mainstream healthcare rather than segregated specialty clinics. In some countries, methadone could be prescribed by a general practitioner and dispensed at a regular pharmacy with the same level of discretion afforded to any other chronic disease medication. In others, harm reduction programs went further than methadone and buprenorphine, establishing supervised consumption facilities and even heroin-assisted treatment programs in which patients with severe, treatment-resistant addiction could receive pharmaceutical-grade heroin in a medical setting. The outcomes data from these programs was, to put it diplomatically, not helpful for those who argued that the American model was the only reasonable approach. The United Kingdom's approach to methadone treatment developed somewhat differently from the American model, partly because the regulatory and cultural context was different, and partly because the British system had a different starting point. In the United Kingdom, general practitioners could prescribe methadone directly, and patients could fill those prescriptions at community pharmacies, a model that integrated addiction treatment into the existing primary care infrastructure rather than segregating it into specialised clinics. The daily attendance requirement existed in some forms, but was implemented with more flexibility, and the general orientation of the system was somewhat less punitive in its assumptions about patient behaviour. The British system had its own problems and its own critiques, but the basic structural difference, treatment delivered through existing healthcare channels rather than through a separate, heavily regulated apparatus, produced a patient experience that was measurably less burdensome and a treatment relationship that looked somewhat more like ordinary medicine. Switzerland's heroin-assisted treatment program, which began as a controlled trial in the 1990s and became a permanent part of the treatment landscape after the evidence supported it, represented the furthest end of the harm reduction spectrum. Patients who had not responded to methadone or buprenorphine, who continued to use illicit heroin despite treatment, who cycled repeatedly through crisis and stabilization without achieving lasting improvement, were offered pharmaceutical heroin, administered under supervision in medical facilities. The results were striking. Patients stabilized. Criminal activity dropped dramatically. Health improved. Housing stability increased. The program did not cure addiction in any philosophical sense. It managed it, effectively and humanely, in a population for whom other management approaches had failed. The Swiss voted on the program in a national referendum and approved it. The American political imagination, for reasons that are probably not difficult to identify at this point in our story, did not find the Swiss experiment a compelling model. Australia's harm reduction infrastructure, which included supervised injection facilities operating legally in several states, provided another data point. These facilities allowed people to use pre-obtained drugs under medical supervision, with staff trained to respond to overdoses and to connect people with treatment when they were ready. Overdose deaths at the facilities, 0. The evidence that these programs saved lives without increasing drug use in surrounding communities was consistent across multiple evaluations. The American response to this evidence was, largely to note, that it had been produced in Australia, which was not America, and to continue not implementing anything similar. By the mid-2010s, the opioid crisis in the United States had shifted in a direction that complicated everything that had been established about treatment over the previous 50 years. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin, had flooded the illicit drug supply to a degree that made the heroin epidemic of the 1960s look, in retrospect, almost quaint in its consistency. The challenge fentanyl posed to methadone treatment was partly practical. The drug was so potent and so fast-acting that the transition from active fentanyl use into treatment had become more medically complex. The doses of methadone required to stabilize patients who had been using fentanyl regularly were, in some cases, higher than the doses that had been standard in clinic settings, and the regulations that governed maximum doses became relevant in ways that they hadn't been before. Researchers, clinicians, and patients were once again having the conversation that had been ongoing since 1965. Are the rules serving the patients, or are the rules serving something else? Fentanyl changed the pharmacological landscape of addiction in ways that the treatment system was not designed to accommodate. The drug's extraordinary potency meant that the tolerance built by regular fentanyl users was substantially higher than the tolerance built by heroin users, a fact with direct clinical implications for how quickly methadone doses needed to be increased during induction, and how high those doses needed to go to achieve the blocking effect that made treatment effective. Clinics that had been operating on dosing protocols developed for heroin-era patients found themselves treating a population with different pharmacological needs, and the regulatory frameworks that constrained maximum doses and the pace of dose increases created friction between clinical necessity and institutional rules. The induction process, the period of transitioning a patient from active drug use onto a stabilizing methadone dose, became particularly fraught in the fentanyl era. Standard induction protocols had been developed with the assumption that patients presenting for treatment had opioid tolerance consistent with heroin use. Fentanyl users often had much higher tolerance, which meant that doses adequate to prevent withdrawal and block cravings were higher than standard protocols anticipated. But the protocols had been written to prevent overly rapid dosing, which carried its own risks. Methadone's accumulation in the body meant that doses that seemed manageable on day 1 could reach toxic levels by day 4 if increased too quickly. Threading the needle between undertreating and overtreating required clinical judgment that the regulatory framework was not always designed to accommodate. Alongside the treatment challenges, fentanyl changed the overdose landscape in ways that made the availability of treatment more urgently important, while simultaneously making access to treatment more difficult for some patients. The unpredictability of fentanyl-adulterated drug supply, the fact that any given purchase might contain a lethal dose or a minimal one with no reliable way to know in advance, compressed the timeline between active addiction and death in ways that made the relatively slow process of entering and stabilizing in methadone treatment a race against a much faster clock. Patients who might have survived years of heroin addiction while ambivalent about treatment were now dying in months. The system's capacity to respond quickly to lower barriers to entry, to meet people where they were rather than where the regulations assumed they would be, had never been more important. Whether the system was equipped to respond with the urgency the moment required was a question that produced different answers depending on which clinic, which state, and which regulatory moment you were examining. Return now to the original question: why did the pill make heroin users impossible to quit? The answer, told in full, is more complicated than it first appears, and it depends entirely on what you mean by quit and what you mean by impossible. If you mean, why does methadone create its own physical dependence, making abrupt discontinuation dangerous and difficult? That is a pharmacological question with a pharmacological answer, having to do with the drug's long half-life, its fat solubility, and the time required for the brain's opioid receptors to recalibrate to a world without it. If you mean, why do so many methadone patients remain in treatment for years or decades rather than tapering off and achieving abstinence, that is a different question, and the honest answer involves a reckoning with what we know about opioid use disorder as a chronic condition, with the relapse rates for patients who discontinue medication, and with the fact that for many patients, long-term maintenance is not a failure of the treatment, but the treatment working exactly as intended, in the same way that long-term insulin use is not a failure of diabetes management, but diabetes management functioning correctly. The pill did not make quitting heroin impossible. For millions of patients, it made living possible. Those two things are not the same, and the history of methadone is in large part the history of a world that kept confusing them. The word impossible deserves some attention, because it has been used in this conversation in two very different ways that rarely get distinguished clearly. The first use is pharmacological. Methadone is physically difficult to stop, and the experience of trying to stop it is genuinely arduous. And for many patients, the prospect of enduring that experience is one factor among several in their decision to remain in maintenance. This is true, and it is important, and it is a known property of the drug that was present from the beginning of its use. Nobody accidentally discovered that stopping methadone was hard. It was always going to be hard, for the same chemical reasons that made it effective. The second use is something closer to sociological. People on methadone maintenance tend to stay on methadone maintenance, and this tendency is sometimes framed as evidence that the drug has trapped them, that the treatment has created a new dependency that serves the interests of clinics or pharmaceutical companies, or the system more broadly, rather than the patients. This framing requires evidence that has not materialized. What the evidence shows is that patients stay in treatment because treatment works, and discontinuation produces relapse at high rates, not because they have been manipulated into continued participation by anything other than the functioning of their own neurobiology and their own reasoned assessment of what has kept them alive and stable. The question of whether the pill made quitting impossible is, at its deepest level, a question about what we want treatment to accomplish, and whose definition of success we are using. If success means a person who takes no opioid-related medication and maintains that state indefinitely, then methadone maintenance does not produce success, and the impossibility of quitting is a genuine problem. If success means a person who is alive, functional, employed, present in their family, not committing crimes, not using heroin, managing a chronic condition with the medication that controls it, then methadone maintenance produces success at rates that other approaches have not matched, and the impossibility of quitting is not a problem. It is, in a very real sense, the point. The pill does not make heroin users impossible to quit. It makes their lives possible to live. For 60 years, the world has been arguing about whether that is enough. For the patients who are alive because of it, the question tends to have a clear answer. There is a particular kind of humiliation that methadone patients who receive take-home doses describe encountering at regular pharmacies in countries and contexts where that is permitted, and it has nothing to do with the medication itself. It has to do with the pharmacist. Not every pharmacist, and not always, but with enough consistency that it shows up in patient testimonials, in research interviews, and in the quiet conversations that happen in waiting rooms among people who have learned to compare notes on which pharmacies are safe and which ones are not. The experience goes something like this. A patient presents their prescription, and something changes in the interaction. The tone shifts. The questions become more pointed than they would be for a patient presenting a blood pressure medication or an antidepressant. Sometimes the pharmacist declines to fill it, citing stock issues that patients suspect are pretextual. Sometimes the transaction is completed, but in a way that feels designed to make the patient aware, without anything being said directly, that they are not entirely welcome here. Pharmacy staff, like everyone else who encountered methadone in a professional context, brought their personal beliefs about addiction into those interactions, and the professional norms that existed to constrain those beliefs had not always kept pace with what the clinical evidence said about medication-assisted treatment. Pharmacy refusals were not merely anecdotal complaints. Surveys of pharmacies in multiple states found that a significant percentage either did not stock methadone for addiction treatment at all, or stocked it in quantities that were inadequate to serve a consistent patient population. The reasons given range from the logistical, maintaining adequate inventory, required managing controlled substance regulations that some pharmacies preferred to avoid, to the more frankly attitudinal. Pharmacists, like physicians and nurses, received training that historically emphasized addiction as a behavioral problem rather than a medical condition, and some carried into their professional practice the same stigma that shaped the broader cultural response to people in treatment. The result was a dispensing landscape that was, in many areas, effectively hostile to patients who had been given prescriptions that the pharmacies they approached were unwilling to fill. This created a geography of access within cities that patients navigated with the pragmatic resourcefulness that people develop when they have no other option. Certain pharmacies were known to be reliable, others were known to be difficult. This knowledge circulated through patient communities, shared in waiting rooms, in online forums, in the informal networks of people who had learned through experience which counters would serve them without incident, and which would require a negotiation that left them feeling diminished before they had even received their medication. The pharmacies that were known to be welcoming tended to be independent pharmacies rather than chains. Pharmacies in neighbourhoods with higher concentrations of patients in treatment. Pharmacies where the staff had developed experience and familiarity with the population. The chain pharmacies in affluent neighbourhoods were, as a general pattern, less reliable, which meant that patients were often effectively directed toward the pharmacies least likely to be convenient to wherever they lived and worked. For patients in countries where buprenorphine and methadone were prescribed through primary care and dispensed at community pharmacies, the pharmacist relationship was potentially one of the more normalizing features of treatment, a point of contact with the ordinary healthcare system that signalled, through the very unremarkableness of the transaction, that their condition was a medical one being managed like other medical conditions. When the pharmacist interaction was routinely dignified, it contributed to the treatment experience in ways that were not quantified in clinical trials, but were not insignificant in the lives of people rebuilding a sense of themselves as ordinary members of society rather than members of a designated problem population. Few chapters in the history of methadone generated more heat, more misunderstanding, and more genuine ethical complexity than the question of pregnant women in treatment and the babies they delivered. When a woman who is dependent on opioids, whether heroin or methadone, gives birth, the infant who has been exposed to opioids throughout development will experience withdrawal after delivery. This condition, called neonatal abstinence syndrome, involves symptoms that are genuinely distressing to witness: trembling, inconsolable crying, feeding difficulties, sleep disruption. It requires medical management and, in many cases, a hospital stay that can extend for weeks. The headlines this generated were, in many cases, not careful. Methadone babies became a phrase deployed in context that implied that the drug treatment itself was the cause of harm, rather than the underlying opioid dependence, which would have produced the same withdrawal in an infant regardless of whether the mother was using heroin or receiving methadone. The medical consensus held that methadone maintenance during pregnancy was safer than untreated opioid addiction during pregnancy, safer for the mother, and safer for the fetus, because the stabilization that methadone provided reduced the risks associated with chaotic, uncontrolled opioid use during pregnancy. Neonatal abstinence syndrome was manageable. The alternative was worse. The nuance, predictably, did not travel as well as the headline. The medical evidence on this point was consistent and, by the standards of clinical research, fairly clear. Untreated opioid dependence during pregnancy was associated with a range of serious adverse outcomes: preterm birth, low birth weight, placental abruption, fetal growth restriction, and significantly elevated maternal mortality risk from overdose. Women who remained in active addiction during pregnancy were less likely to receive prenatal care, more likely to experience unstable housing and domestic violence, and more likely to deliver in crisis conditions. Methadone maintenance, by stabilizing the pregnancy and keeping the mother in contact with the healthcare system, reduced these risks substantially. The baby would experience neonatal abstinence syndrome either way. The opioid exposure during pregnancy was the cause, not the specific opioid used, but the baby born to a mother in stable treatment was more likely to be born at term, at healthy weight, in a hospital with adequate prenatal records and a plan for managing the withdrawal. What the headlines produced, in terms of policy consequences, was sometimes directly harmful to the population it claimed to be concerned about. Reports emphasizing neonatal abstinence syndrome as a methadone problem, rather than an opioid dependence problem with a manageable medical solution, contributed to an environment in which pregnant women in methadone treatment faced heightened scrutiny from child protective services, in which some states moved to classify neonatal abstinence syndrome as evidence of child abuse or neglect by the mother, and in which the fear of legal consequences led some pregnant women to avoid disclosing their medication status to obstetric providers or to avoid prenatal care altogether. The women most likely to be harmed by these policies were the ones already most vulnerable: women with histories in the child welfare system, women of colour, women without stable housing or insurance, women who had already learned that the healthcare and legal systems were not reliably safe environments for them. The policy response to a framing that was medically inaccurate produced outcomes that were worse than the problem the framing was supposed to address. This is a pattern that appears with some regularity in the history of methadone policy. It is not comforting. Picture a county in rural Appalachia in 2015. The opioid crisis is at full intensity. Prescription pills have flooded the community for years, dispensed by pain clinics that asked few questions and answered even fewer. Now the pills are harder to get, and heroin, and increasingly fentanyl, have moved in to fill the gap. People are dying. The county has one substance abuse treatment centre, and it does not offer methadone. The nearest methadone clinic is an hour and 20 minutes away by car, over mountain roads that are impassable for several months of the year. A patient who wants to begin methadone treatment needs to make that drive every morning 7 days a week for months before earning the take-home doses that would make the daily trip unnecessary. They need a car or a ride or money for a bus that does not exist on this route. They need to be able to miss work every morning or find a job with hours that accommodate the clinic schedule. They need to not have 3 children who need to be at school by 8 and a partner who works nights and nobody to watch them. The geography of methadone access in the United States was not an accident. It was the physical expression of regulatory decisions that had concentrated treatment in urban specialty clinics rather than distributing it through primary care, and the people living at the far end of that geography paid the cost of those decisions with their lives. The rural access crisis in addiction treatment did not begin with fentanyl. It had been building since the 1970s as the clinic model took hold in cities and the regulatory barriers to opening new clinics created a landscape where treatment facilities were concentrated in the areas with the most established healthcare infrastructure, the largest patient populations to justify the regulatory investment, and the most organised advocacy communities to push for access. Rural communities had less of all three. The result was a map of treatment availability that tracked, with uncomfortable precision, the map of existing healthcare inequality. The same counties that lacked adequate primary care, mental health services, and hospital capacity also lacked addiction treatment, because the regulatory model for addiction treatment required the same infrastructure that was absent everywhere else. When buprenorphine became available in 2002, there was genuine hope that the prescribable in a doctor's office model would solve the rural access problem. A primary care physician in a rural county could, in theory, obtain a waiver to prescribe buprenorphine and treat patients without requiring them to travel to a specialty clinic. In practice, the rural rollout of buprenorphine was slower and more uneven than the urban rollout, for reasons that included physician reluctance to take on the additional regulatory requirements of the waiver system, the relative scarcity of primary care physicians in rural areas to begin with, and the persistent stigma that led some rural physicians to conclude that addiction patients were not the population they wanted to build their practice around. The rural patient who needed medication-assisted treatment found, in many cases, that the theoretical availability of buprenorphine through primary care did not translate into actual availability in their county. Mobile treatment units, vans equipped to dispense methadone and staffed by clinical personnel represented one of the more promising responses to the rural access crisis. Several states developed mobile methadone programs that served patients in communities too small or too remote to support a fixed clinic. The federal regulatory framework eventually accommodated this model, though not without bureaucratic friction that slowed its expansion. Where mobile programs operated, they reached patients who had no other option, in counties where the alternative to a van in a parking lot was no treatment at all. They were not a complete solution. They were evidence that the problem was solvable if the will to solve it existed consistently enough. There is a particular kind of professional exhaustion that accumulates in people who spend 30 years publishing research that clearly demonstrates one thing, and then watch policy continue to do approximately the opposite thing, and the addiction medicine and public health research community that study methadone accumulated a great deal of it. The evidence base for methadone maintenance was not ambiguous, it was not preliminary. By the 1990s, it was decades old, extensively replicated, and pointing in a consistent direction. Maintenance treatment worked, higher doses worked better than lower doses, longer retention in treatment produced better outcomes than shorter retention, and the barriers that restricted access to treatment were costing lives in ways that were measurable and largely preventable. The researchers knew this. They published it. They presented it at conferences. They testified before Congress. And the policy landscape shifted, but slowly, incompletely, and often for reasons that had less to do with the evidence than with the political cost of being seen to be soft on drugs, or the lobbying interests of abstinence-oriented treatment programs, or simple institutional inertia in agencies that had written their methadone regulations in 1972 and had not found sufficient reason to substantially revise them since. The translation problem, the gap between what research finds and what policy implements, is not unique to addiction medicine. Medicine is full of evidence that takes decades to become standard practice, for reasons ranging from physician training inertia to insurance reimbursement structures to the difficulty of changing institutional habits that have calcified over time. But the gap in addiction medicine was wider than in most fields, and the cost of that gap was higher, because the patients who were not receiving evidence-based treatment were not merely experiencing suboptimal outcomes, they were dying. Overdose deaths that would not have occurred if access to treatment had been expanded, relapses that would not have happened if doses had been adequate, patients who left treatment because the daily attendance requirement was incompatible with keeping their job and who were dead within a year. The researchers who documented these patterns developed a shared vocabulary for describing the frustration. Evidence-practice gap, implementation science, knowledge translation. These were professional euphemisms for the phenomenon of watching people die from a problem you understood how to solve and could not get the relevant decision-makers to solve it. Some researchers channeled the frustration into advocacy, testified at hearings, wrote op-eds, partnered with patient organisations, tried to build the political constituency for policy change that the evidence alone had not been able to create. Others focused on producing more and better evidence, on the theory that the failure to act was a failure of evidence quantity or quality, rather than a failure of political will, a theory that the accumulating literature made increasingly difficult to sustain. What kept the research community going, alongside the frustration, was the patients. The follow-up studies that found people who'd been in treatment for 20 years and were alive and employed and present in their families when they would statistically not have been without treatment. The qualitative interviews in which patients described, in specific and ordinary detail, the life that treatment had made possible, not dramatic, not transformed, just continuing, just daily, just alive. The researchers who spent careers arguing for something that kept not happening did so because the people for whom they were arguing were real and present and deserving of a healthcare system that served them with the same evidence-based commitment that it brought to other chronic conditions. The argument has not concluded. The researchers have not stopped making it. The version of recovery that gets told in public, in memoirs, in news profiles, in the motivational speeches at treatment centre fundraisers, tends to have a specific shape. There is a low point, there is a turning point, there is struggle, and then there is transformation. And the transformation is legible and dramatic and ends with the person standing in front of an audience, clean and present and clearly changed. It is a narrative that is true for some people, and genuinely moving when it is true, but it does not describe the experience of the methadone patient who goes to the clinic at 7:15 in the morning and then goes to work and then picks up his kids from school and then makes dinner and then watches television and then goes to sleep and then does it all again tomorrow for 20 years. There is no dramatic arc in that story. There is no moment of transformation that a camera can find. There is just a person living a life that, without treatment, might not have continued, but that with treatment looks, from the outside, unremarkably ordinary. This is what methadone success actually looks like in the lives of millions of patients. Not a story, but a Tuesday. Not a transformation, but a continuity. The absence of crisis as the evidence of stability. A man who is not in an emergency room, not in a jail, not in a morgue. A man who is simply, quietly, invisibly alive, and the pill sitting on his nightstand that made that possible. The invisibility of this recovery is, in some ways, its greatest achievement and its greatest political vulnerability simultaneously. The person who is visibly recovered, who speaks at meetings, who tells their story in interviews, who wears their survival as a public identity, generates the narrative that the culture needs to believe that recovery is possible. They serve a crucial function. But the person who is invisibly stable, who has been taking their medication every morning for 15 years and going to work and not making news, does not generate that narrative. They simply exist, undramatically, in the aggregate statistics that show treatment working at population scale. They are the majority. They are the proof. They are almost entirely absent from the public conversation about what recovery is. What recovery looks like when nobody's watching is in most cases exactly what ordinary life looks like when nobody's watching. A person getting through the week, managing the ordinary difficulties of work and relationships and money and health that everyone manages, without the additional weight of active addiction pressing down on every decision. Experiencing the ordinary joys and disappointments that constitute a life, without filtering them through the distorting lens of a substance that had claimed first priority on every emotional and neurological resource. Not transcendent, not transformed in any way that would make a compelling documentary, just present, just continuing, just there. The methadone patient who has been stable for 20 years has something to teach the culture about what it means to live with a chronic condition that requires ongoing management, about the ordinariness of that management and the dignity of that ordinariness, and the ways in which a life built on daily medication and daily choice and daily unremarkable continuation is not a lesser life than one built on dramatic transformation. It is, in the most important sense, the same life. It goes to work, it comes home, it loves people and argues with them and watches too much television and worries about money and grows older. It is, when nobody is watching, indistinguishable from anyone else's life. And after 60 years of argument about what methadone is and what it means and whether it counts as recovery and whether the people taking it deserve to be treated as patients, that ordinariness, that quiet, unremarkable, daily aliveness is perhaps the most powerful argument that has ever been made on its behalf. And so, here we are, at the end of a story that began in a German laboratory in 1937 with a molecule nobody had named yet, and ended, if it has ended, in the ordinary morning of a person who takes a small dose of medication, drives to work, and lives a life that the statistics said they probably wouldn't. Think about what we have covered tonight. A drug invented for war that became a treatment for addiction. A researcher who looked at heroin dependence and saw a metabolic condition when everyone around him saw a moral failure. Patients who stabilized, found jobs, went home to their families, and were told by judges and counselors and neighbors that their stability didn't count because of what was in their pill. Clinics that required daily attendance for decades. rules written in 1972 that governed lives in 2022. A pandemic that proved in 18 months what 60 years of research had been saying, and a system that noted the proof, nodded thoughtfully, and changed less than it should have. It is a story about medicine, yes. But it is also a story about who we decide deserves medicine, and on what terms, and with how much dignity, and how much suspicion, and how much daily proof of worthiness. It is a story about the distance between what we know and what we do, and about all the lives that fall into that distance and are lost there. The people who built this treatment, who fought for it, who stayed in it for decades despite everything the system asked them to absorb, the inconvenience, the stigma, the daily paper cup, the judge's conditions, the family members' doubt. Those people were not waiting for a dramatic moment of transformation. They were doing something quieter and, in its own way, more difficult. They were showing up, every morning, in the ordinary, unremarkable, invisible act of continuing to be alive. There is a kind of courage in that which the culture does not celebrate well, because it does not make a good story. It has no climax. It has no before and after photograph. It has only the accumulation of ordinary days, each one chosen, each one managed, each one survived. So tonight, as you settle deeper into wherever you're listening from, your bed, your couch, your car parked somewhere quiet because the house is too loud, maybe take a moment for the people in this story. Not the researchers, though they deserve their acknowledgement. Not the policymakers, who mostly do not. But the patients, the ones who were told their recovery was not real recovery and kept recovering anyway. The ones who drove an hour and 20 minutes every morning over mountain roads. The ones who sat in waiting rooms at 7 a.m. and drank from small paper cups and went to work and did not tell anyone why they were sometimes late. The ones who are alive tonight because of a pill that a German laboratory produced in 1937 without any idea what it was going to mean. They did not get a monument. They did not get a memoir deal. Most of them did not get a standing ovation or a profile in a magazine. What they got, if the treatment worked and the access was there and the dose was right and the clinic didn't close and the judge didn't intervene, was a Tuesday and then a Wednesday and then another year and another. That is not nothing. That is in fact everything. Let the story settle now. Let the complexity of it rest somewhere soft and quiet inside you. Let your breath slow. Let your body remember that it is safe, that it is warm, that it is here, which is, when you think about it, the only thing any of us are ever really trying to arrange. Sleep well. The morning will come ordinary and unheroic and entirely worth having. Good night.